The semester had ended, and the 9 students were so excited to go home for Christmas. They hired a small bus, their laughter filling the air. They talked about what they would eat, the gifts they'd give, and the joy of seeing their families again. The road stretched out before them, smooth and long like a ribbon under the golden sun. Trees lined the sides, the leaves swaying gently as if waving the students goodbye. Everything felt perfect. It was the kind of day that made you feel like nothing could go wrong. Then suddenly, the bus slowed down. The driver, an old man with a face like dried yam, squinted ahead. "What's that?" he muttered, pointing. By the side of the road stood an old woman. Her gray wrapper hung loosely around her thin frame, and her hands waved desperately in the air. Beside her was a broken-down van, its tire flat and useless. "Help me, please help me," she shouted, her voice cracking like dry wood. The students leaned out of the windows, their hearts softening. "Driver, stop now," said Boa, the gentle one. "She needs help." The driver shook his head. "This road is dangerous." "I don't trust it," he said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Let's keep going." But the students wouldn't hear it. "Ah, Uncle Driver, how can you say that?" asked Tommy, her eyes wide. "Can't you see she's an old woman? What if she's someone's grandmother?" The others agreed, nodding and pleading with the driver to stop. Reluctantly, the driver sighed and pulled over, muttering under his breath. The students stepped out of the bus, their faces bright with kindness. "Mama, don't worry," said Ollie, trying to comfort the woman. "We'll help you." The old woman's face lit up like a candle in the dark. "Thank you, my children," she said, her voice trembling. But behind her smile was something strange, something hidden like a snake in tall grass. And just like that, the students walked straight into a trap. But before anyone could take another step, the old woman let out a loud, piercing whistle. It cut through the air like a blade, sending chills down their spines. From the bushes, men armed with guns burst out like a pack of wolves. Their faces were hidden with masks, and their voices boomed, "Everybody down, now!" The students froze, their hearts pounding like talking drums. "What is this?" Uchi whispered, his voice shaking. "Lie down," one of the men barked, waving his gun. "Do as I say, or I'll shoot." The students dropped to the ground, trembling like leaves caught in a storm. The men moved quickly, tying their hands behind their backs with rough ropes. Blindfolds were tied tightly around their eyes, plunging them into darkness. "Please don't hurt us," Chimaka begged, her voice breaking like glass. The kidnappers ignored their cries. "Move," they shouted, pushing the students toward the bush. As they stumbled into the thick forest, the sound of the bus engine starting again echoed faintly in the distance. The old woman, whom the kidnappers had used as bait, was gone, and so was their freedom. The kidnappers pushed the students deeper into the forest, their rough hands shoving them forward. The forest was dark, and the path was uneven, filled with roots that grabbed at their feet like hidden hands. The students stumbled and fell, their knees scraping against the ground. "Keep moving," one of the men barked, his voice sharp like a whip. The blindfolds made it worse. The students couldn't see where they were going, they could only hear the hooting of owls, the chopping of crickets, and the rustling of leaves that sounded like whispers. Each sound made their hearts race, it felt like the forest itself was alive and watching them. Chimaka tripped over a root and fell hard. "Please, I can't walk anymore," she cried, her voice trembling. But one of the men yanked her up roughly. "Move, or I'll leave you here for the wild animals," he growled. Finally, they reached a clearing. The kidnappers shoved the students to the ground. The ropes around their hands and the blindfolds were removed, and for the first time, the students could see their captors clearly. There were 5 men, each one looking more dangerous than the next. "Now listen," one of the men shouted, his voice echoing through the night. "Call your parents. Tell them to bring money if they want you back alive." The students exchanged terrified glances, their hands shook as they reached for their phones. One by one, they called their parents, their voices filled with fear. Mama, they've kidnapped me, Ollie said, his voice cracking. Please send money, they said they'll kill me. And then, one by one, the others followed, calling their parents and pleading with them to cooperate with the kidnappers. And after every call, one of the armed men forcefully took their phone and told their parents, if you really want to see your child back alive, you should drop the money before sunset tomorrow. And then, with that, he hung up the phone and moved on to the next. Two of the students, Yuke and Bola, were lucky. Their parents were wealthy and agreed to pay the ransom quickly. The kidnappers untied them the following morning after receiving the payments and let them go, shoving them back toward the road. But for the others, hope began to slip away. Kayamika sat quietly, tears streaming down her face. Her mother was a poor widow, and Kayamika knew there was no money to send. The kidnappers looked at the remaining students and sneered. The rest of you better pray, one said coldly, because if your families don't pay, you won't see tomorrow. The forest grew darker, and the night seemed heavier, like a thick blanket of fear pressing down on them. The students huddled together, their hearts sinking like stones in water. The days passed slowly, like the ticking of a broken clock for the students who remained. Fear wrapped around them like a cold, heavy chain. The kidnappers' voices grew louder, their faces darker. Each time they shouted, it felt like thunder in the students' hearts. You think we're playing with you, one of the men roared, his eyes burned like fire as he grabbed a student, dragging him away. No, please, no, the boy screamed, but his cries were swallowed by the forest. Minutes later, a single gunshot rang out. The sound tore through the air like a blade, and silence followed. The boy had been shot dead since his family hadn't been able to raise any money. The remaining students huddled together, shaking and crying. Why are they doing this? Tommy whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. To scare us, Ollie replied, his voice barely audible. To scare our families into paying. But fear wasn't enough to stop the kidnappers. Each day, they took another student, and each day, another gunshot echoed in the forest, taking the lives of innocent students. One per day, the students cried, begged, and pleaded, but the men had no mercy. Jamaka sat quietly in the corner, her face stricken with tears. She thought of her mother, a widow who had nothing to give. Mama, Jamaka whispered to herself, her voice breaking. How will you save me? Far away, in a small, humble house, Shaka's mother knelt by her bed, her knees sore and her eyes red from crying, but she refused to stop. God, hear me, she prayed, her voice shaking but strong. Bring my daughter back to me. Don't let them hurt her. Each night, Shaka's mother wept and prayed, her words rising to the heavens like smoke from a burning fire. But back in the forest, Shaka's hope began to fade. The kidnappers' anger grew like a storm, and the students wondered if they would live to see another day. The forest grew quieter with each passing night, as if even the animals were afraid to move. The students knew one thing: time was running out. The seventh night came, and the forest was silent, heavy with an uneasy calm. The students huddled together, their breaths shallow. The kidnappers sat by their fire, their faces shadowed by the flickering flames, but something was different tonight. The men were restless, their voices sharp like broken glass. I want more money, one of the men shouted suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He stood up, his fists clenched. I did the hardest work. I deserve more. The others turned to him, their eyes narrowing like hawks. You what? Work did you do? Another snapped. We all work together. You don't get more than the rest of us. The first man stepped closer, his voice rising like thunder. Don't lie. I planned everything. Without me, you'd have nothing. The argument grew louder and louder, the words cutting through the night like sharp knives. You're greedy, one shouted. You think you're better than us, another growled. Then, like a storm breaking loose, they started pushing and shoving each other. Fists flew, and curses filled the air. Their guns fell to the ground, forgotten in their rage. From the corner, the students watched with wide eyes, their hearts pounding. Ali leaned close to Chamaka and whispered, What's happening? Shaka's eyes never left the men, her mind racing. They are fighting over the money, she said softly. Then, like a spark lighting dry wood, an idea formed in her head. This is our chance, Jamaka whispered, her voice steady. We have to escape now. The other students looked at her. Their fear melted into determination. The kidnappers were too busy fighting to notice them. The time to act had come. The kidnappers' fight raged on, their shouts filling the forest like a storm. Fists flew, and curses spilled into the air. Their guns lay forgotten on the ground, and their rage blinded them to everything else. Jamaka whispered urgently, "Now, untie your ropes." Her fingers moved fast, loosening the knots around her wrists. The others followed, their hands trembling as they worked quickly to free themselves. Go, go, Ali urged, his voice low but firm. Barefoot and desperate, the 4 students rose and ran into the forest. The darkness swallowed them, branches tearing at their clothes and scratching their skin. The forest felt alive, its trees stretching out like claws to grab them. Don't look back, Jamaka gasped, her breath heavy. Just run. But the sound of the escape reached the kidnappers. One of the men stopped fighting and turned sharply. They're running, he shouted. The kidnappers grabbed their guns and bolted after them. The students ran faster, their hearts pounding like drums, but the kidnappers were closing in. Suddenly, a loud shot cracked through the night, freezing them in their tracks. The kidnappers had caught up. Before anyone could react, Tommy screamed as one of the men grabbed her. Run, she cried, her voice breaking. Save yourselves. No, we can't leave you, Jamaka shouted, tears streaming down her face. But the other kidnappers were closing in, and Ali pulled Jamaka forward. We have to go, he said, his voice trembling. As they ran, another shot rang out, louder than the first. Tommy's scream stopped, the sound of her voice, once so full of life, was gone. Shaka's tears blurred her vision, but she kept running. Her legs felt like they would give out, but she pushed forward, her heart heavy with grief and fear. Finally, after what felt like forever, they saw a flicker of light in the distance. It was a village, its warm glow piercing the cold darkness of the forest. The 3 of them stumbled into the village, their bodies weak and trembling. Help us, Jamaka cried, her voice cracking at SE. Please help us. Villagers came rushing out, their lanterns lighting up the students' faces, pale with fear and exhaustion. An old man stepped forward. What happened, my children? He asked, his voice filled with worry. We were kidnapped, Ali said, his voice shaking. They killed Tommy. They're still in the forest. The villagers didn't waste a moment. Some wrapped the students in blankets and gave them water, while others ran to alert the police. Jamaka sat on the ground, her tears falling silently. Tommy was gone, and the weight of that loss hung heavy in the air. But for the 3 who made it out, the nightmare was finally over. The village had given them safety, and now justice was on its way. The morning sun rose slowly, painting the village in soft gold. The air was filled with the sound of birds chirping, but Jamaka, Ali, and Kumi were too tired to notice. They had barely slept, their minds replaying the horrors of the night before. The villagers had alerted the police, and by dawn, officers arrived in their vans, armed and ready. Show us where they are, one officer said. Ali, his hand shaking, pointed toward the forest. The police moved swiftly, their steps firm and determined. The kidnappers, still in the forest, were caught before they could escape. Their shouts and curses echoed through the village as the officers dragged them away, their weapons confiscated. Justice will be served, the chief officer said, his voice steady. The students, though still shaken, felt a small weight lift from their hearts. By noon, Jamaka, Ali, and Kumi were escorted back home. Jamaka sat quietly in the police van, her hands gripping the edge of her seat as the vehicle rolled into her neighborhood. She saw her mother standing outside, her eyes red from sleepless nights of crying and praying. The moment Jamaka stepped out, her mother ran to her, wrapping her in a tight embrace. Shamaka, my child, she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed Jamaka's forehead. God heard my prayers. You're alive, you're safe. Jamaka clung to her mother, her own tears falling freely. Mama, I thought I would never see you again, she whispered, her voice breaking. Later, as they sat together in their small home, Jamaka shared everything that had happened. Her mother listened, holding her hand tightly, her heart breaking for the daughter she almost lost. Ali and Kumi also returned to their families, welcomed with hugs and tears. The pain of losing Tommy weighed heavily on them, but they promised to honor her memory by being more cautious in the future. As the days passed, the students reflected on the ordeal. Cha spoke softly to her mother one evening, her eyes thoughtful. Mama, not everyone who looks helpless can be trusted. We thought we were helping that old woman, but it was all a lie, she was a trap. Her mother nodded, her hand resting gently on Shaka's shoulder. Kindness is good, my child, but it must be mixed with wisdom. Never forget that. And so, life slowly returned to normal. The forest, the kidnappers, and the terror became part of a story the students would never forget, but they also learned something powerful: to trust their instincts, to stay cautious, and to never take safety for granted. For Mara and her friends, home was no longer just a place, it was a reminder of survival, love, and second chances. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.